I absolutely cannot stand behind a podium. I just can't stand still for all that long. Probably has something to do with the fact that Bill has diagnosed me as having career deficit disorder, which is absolutely related to my being on the board with AACRC. I also see Dick Kruger in the audience. He's the New York State ATSA president, and I'm on the board with New York ATSA and the New York State Alliance for Sex Offender Service Providers. And I'm also adjunct faculty at Sage Graduate School, and I see many of my students here. You all get credit for coming. Nice job. And Dr. Anda said that there will not be a quiz today, and that's true, but for you guys, I hope you're realizing which of this information can show up in your final papers. Yeah, take lots of notes. Okay. Before I get going, I've got a pretty ambitious agenda to get through, and I've got about an hour to do it. I stand between you and lunch, and I'm sorry for that. And I'm more sorry for the fact, and my students will attest to this, that I've never finished a thought in less than 3 hours. But I'm going to try today, and I'm going to try and get through a lot of material in an hour, so I'm going to go fast. And because I am a social worker, I really do prefer interactive conversations, discussion, dialogue. This is a big, big group, and it's a wonderful group, and I imagine that all of you will have tons of insight, tons of questions, tons of dialogue to generate and to contribute to a larger and ongoing conversation. And so because we can't really do that in the interest of time, you do have sheets. If you have questions, feel free to jot them down, and all of the speakers today will be on the panel after lunch. And so I'm going to try and cruise through this material. I'm going to try and talk a little bit more, if you haven't figured out already, that ACEs are absolutely relevant to every single one of you. And I know that the audience really is quite a range of individuals. We have educators, we have physicians, we have state policymakers, we have practitioners, we have people probably just hearing about ACEs for the very first time today, and people who are in the deep end and really working and thinking and muddling through the implications for treatment, practice, and policy. And that's a really nice combination of people. And just to kind of share a story with you, as I was standing backstage earlier, the provost, when he came off, grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Can you come outside? I need to talk to you." And I immediately had a mild trauma reaction. I thought that I was in trouble, and he took me outside, and you probably can't see from here, but I walked in with a LaSalle lapel pin. I'm now wearing a UAlbany lapel pin, and he said to me that he's a fan of collecting lapel pins, and he was wondering if he could continue an Olympics tradition with me and trade lapel pins. And so he walked out of here with a LaSalle pin, which he promised to wear when he comes to visit us, Bill. And I got a UAlbany pin, which is fantastic because I am a graduate of the UAlbany MSW program, and this is a lot like the Olympics. That I think that throughout the Capital District, all of the best and brightest and most talented people are here today. And we're going to come together for a couple of days and really talk about some challenging issues and really walk away, I hope, starting or with some momentum for an ongoing dialogue. We're not going to fix anything, we're not going to solve anything, we're not going to come away with all of the answers today, but you will leave with questions, you will leave with thoughts, and I hope that each and every one of you goes back to your home agency and back to your practice and back to your colleagues and continues this conversation and start networking with one another. Because I do believe that the answers here are not working in isolation, but are in that collaborative process. And so once I help make this a little bit more relevant and put a finer point on why it does impact each and every one of you today, I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing at LaSalle. And this is not because we have all the answers. This is not because we are perfect. We are far from it. But we're learning, and it's dynamic. And one of the things I like about working at LaSalle is that we are restless, that I'm not the only one there with career deficit disorder. And we're always asking about how we could do better and do more and be different and modify what it is we're doing to become more effective in working with youth and families. And so I'd like to share a little bit with you today about how ACES has impacted us, our practice, our procedures, our training, and some of the things we're not so good at, that we still struggle with, and that we're still working on, and that I hope that after today, we can be in touch with one another and be figuring out how to share what we're good at and shoring up one another's weaknesses as we go. I want to start with a clip. It's a clip that I use in many trainings. Probably all our LaSalle staff up in the corner rolling their eyes and like, here we go again, Dave with Antwone Fisher, right? But it's a powerful clip. Just show of hands, how many people have seen Antwone Fisher? Many of you. Okay. For those of you who haven't, Antwone Fisher is real. He's a real person. He wrote a memoir, and his memoir was turned into a movie, which it was very, very well done, in my opinion. Denzel Washington plays a psychiatrist who's got some good skills. So he had some good training, good consultation. And we could debrief his intervention strategy and abilities as a psychotherapist and psychiatrist. But what I really want you to pay attention to is Antwone through this scene. And Antwone Fisher, it's important to know, was a foster child. He was born to a drug-addicted mother in prison and was taken away from her care and placed into foster care, where he was routinely and statistically abused. In fact, I'd go one step further and say that he was tortured in his foster care experience. He was exposed to sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect. And at some point in his life, early on, he runs away from that home and he finds himself in the Navy. And what the scene that we see is after he begins to get in trouble in the Navy, he's got behavior problems. And like many of the youth and families that we work with, he's got some maladaptive coping skills. And when he gets stressed, when he gets challenged, when senior officers get in his face, he tends to swing at them, which I understand is frowned upon in the military. So they throw him into treatment with Denzel Washington, and Denzel Washington is doing assessment to determine whether or not he is fit for continued service in the military. And they form a strong relationship, a strong therapeutic bond. And what the scene that we see here is Antwone's reaction to that therapeutic termination, the end of that relationship. And it triggers a trauma reaction in Antwone Fisher. And there will be a flashback scene. And because we're talking about trauma and self-care and how to be more mindful of those things, I want to let you know that if you haven't seen this scene, it is a powerful scene, it is a graphic scene, it is violent, there is a gunshot, and it's hard to get up and get out of this room, but please know this ahead of time and do take care of yourselves in any way that you need to get through the scene. And as you're looking at the scene, as you're watching it, just be thinking about these couple of things. You've got notebooks in front of you. So just jot down some thoughts. How does the scene make you feel? What happened in the scene? Can you sequence the events in time and kind of break it down, like the frames in the movie? And I want to come back after the clip and talk about who you think the victim is and why, which is going to launch us into a discussion about implications for policy, treatment, intervention, juvenile justice, so on and so forth. And that'll be the backdrop for our conversation today for the next hour or so. Okay? So what happened? Anyone? Just call it out. What happened? What'd you say? Abandonment? Abandonment happened? Or was that felt? What happened? What was the sequence of events? Right, he was triggered. The termination of the relationship, the bond that he had with Denzel Washington, and you heard at the end, they closed by saying, "I love you, son." The relationship was powerful, meaningful, corrective, therapeutic. And at the termination of that relationship, it triggered all of the abandonment, all the loss, all the grief, everyone who's ever walked out on Antwone. And then what happened? What did you see? Where did he go in his head? To the past, right? A flashback. He went back to a moment in his life where he lost someone who was just as significant as that person played by Denzel Washington, someone he loved, someone who loved him. And what did you see in that scene? He and Jesse get together. I don't know if you picked it up, but where was Antwone before he goes to Jesse's house? Homeless shelter. He's on the streets. Smells, he hasn't eaten. When he eats, he's eating quickly, like someone's going to take his food, probably because somebody has been taking his food. And then what happens? Jesse wants him to watch his back, doesn't say why, but Antwone immediately goes to, there's danger. Someone's out to get you, right? Then what happens? He gets what? Say it again? Cleaned up. Yep, he gets cleaned up. Gets a meal in his belly, gets some clean clothes, shower, right? Washes all that street and homeless funk off. Yep. Then what? Where do they go? Convenience store. Then what happens? His friend robs the store, Jesse robs the store, and then Jesse gets shot. Who's the victim? Antwone, the store owner? Everybody. Everybody's the victim here. When the cops show up, who are they looking for? Antwone. Why? He's an accomplice. He's an accessory to an armed robbery, right? And a homicide, self-defense, shooting of a young man. For those of you that say Antwone's the victim, why? You must be social workers. Because why? He's left with the trauma. He's left with the trauma. He is a victim. Something happened to him, right? And this, I think, has profound implications for juvenile justice, criminal justice, and how many youth in my professional career have come to me. To be in my office means you've gotten in a lot of trouble. You've hurt people. I treat people who have hurt people sexually, physically, verbally. They don't do nice things to one another. And yet, underneath all that, I've come to recognize a significant degree of trauma, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Dr. Randa talked a little bit about those primal responses to trauma. Any traumatic event, any stress event leads us to one of three places: fight, flight, freeze. Fight response in a maladaptive, although, I struggle with these words a little bit. And Antwone Fisher, he grew up in an extremely abusive household. He was tortured by his foster mother, was sexually abused by his foster sister. And at one point in his life, and you can see this if you watch the entire movie, that at one point he starts to physically fight back. His foster mother is beating him with a shoe, and he rips the shoe out of her hand, and he starts to hit her with it and throws her at it. And so he starts to develop a fight response, which I think in that context is pretty adaptive. It makes sense. It keeps him safe. But when you take Antwone out of that environment and then drop him in the environment of the military, when people, senior officers, are in his face challenging him, getting aggressive with him, that triggers that coping skill in Antwone, and that fight response comes out and he knocks him out. So it's the same response triggered by the same threat to his safety and well-being. It's maladaptive only in that it's the wrong context. It's the wrong skill for that particular situation. And so treatment, I think, is all about replacing those coping skills that maybe worked in the street or in your home or in a previous placement or in jail or wherever, and replacing those with a skill set that's more adaptive. Prior to graduate school, I worked with Albany County crime victims. I worked with a number of families and cases and serious incidents, and I worked very, very briefly with Jenna Greishauber's family. And for those of you that may remember, Jenna Greishauber was a nursing student who was brutally killed by a repeat violent offender, and her parents fought for changes in policy and legislation to keep violent offenders incarcerated longer in hopes of protecting someone else like Jenna. And regardless of your position on incarceration, and certainly we heard the downsides on the prison pipeline from Dr. Anda, you could certainly argue that having dangerous people not hurting people on the street is not a bad outcome. And the Greishauber family certainly fought. That was a more adaptive response than Antwone punching people out. Flight responses certainly show up in the youth and families that we treat in a number of ways. Prior to working at LaSalle, I worked at St. Anne's, and I did mostly outpatient work there, but I did treat some of the young women in residential placement there, and many of them ran away. My office happened to be right across the hall from a very popular escape door, and so I would often hear the alarm as they leaned on the crash bar for, I don't know what the delay is, 3, 4, 5 seconds, and then boom, they're gone. And I'm sorry, Tony, I'm not picking on St. Anne's. Kids run away from all sorts of residential facilities, including LaSalle, so sorry about that, Tony. But you know, they were running. And again, I think they were coming from households where running away was adaptive. To flee a dangerous, toxic, hurtful, abusive environment makes sense. You take that child and that behavior and that coping strategy and put them in a new context, St. Anne's, which was therapeutic and helpful and warm and safe. And yet, when they got triggered by some perceived threat, boom, old script starts running and they're out the door, right across the hall from my old office. And so again, that adaptive, maladaptive really has more to do with context, I think, than it does the behavior itself. And I think often we get bogged down in expecting that behavior to change just because they're in now a different context. And I think we have to be more patient with the individuals that we serve. The freeze response, and I don't have a human example here. I have a rabbit here. I've got rabbits that live in my backyard, which is sort of interesting in and of itself because I live in Albany, and it's always amazed me how much wildlife exists in downtown Albany. I don't live far from here, just a couple blocks from the university. I've had turkeys in my backyard and fox, and I've had massive skunk problems, which is another story for another time. But I've got rabbits in my backyard, and for those of you that have seen rabbits when they're scared, like when my daughter is running out the back door of our house to try to catch that rabbit. She's not been successful to date, thankfully for her and probably the rabbit. But what do rabbits do when they get scared? They freeze. They lie very still. Anybody know why? They blend in. Yeah, they're camouflaged, they're colored in a certain way that they sort of blend in with the foliage and the ground cover. It also turns out that carnivores, things that eat other things in the woods, have a bad color vision, and they track things more easily when they're moving. You remember Jurassic Park, when the Tyrannosaurus Rex is coming and the guy says, freeze? Yeah, right, by the way. That would not be my recommendation. But it's because carnivores track movement, and things that are moving are more easily seen by things that eat other things. And so the rabbit has adapted over generations and generations and generations to freeze, and the ones who freeze are less likely to be eaten and grow to reproduce and so on and so forth. Now take that coping skill in my backyard that's effective when my daughter or predator is coming to get the rabbit, and take that rabbit out of my backyard and put them in the street in front of my house. Adaptive, maladaptive coping tool to freeze when a Chevy is coming down the street at 40 miles an hour. Maladaptive. Again, it's the right skill in the wrong time. And I think we see a lot of that with our clients. And we often label that behavior as resistant, defiant, oppositional, aggressive, right? Immune to treatment, we have all sorts of labels for that. And we begin to pathologize behavior that actually makes a lot of sense if you start looking beyond the presenting issues. It's also important to know that as we talk about trauma in the context of working with families, is that implied violence is as powerful to us as actual violence. I have shown that clip, Antwone Fisher, probably hundreds of times to hundreds of audiences, and like my staff will tell you, I will find a way to work Antwone Fisher into just about any conversation that we have. And what I notice is that whenever I show that, I ask, and usually about half to 75% of the audience has seen it before, and that was true, about 75% of you have seen it before. I've seen it hundreds of times. I know exactly what's going to happen. I warned you what was going to happen. And yet, when that gun went off, did anyone notice your reaction to that? You flinched. Many of you drew a breath. Some of you winced and threw your head to the side. Why? Did anyone actually get hurt? Was there actually a gun? Was there actually a bullet? Were any of you at risk or in danger at any point during that scene? No. And you know this cognitively, logically, and yet your body reacts and responds. And we're going to talk a little bit about that system of your brain and your body that responds to perceived and implied threats in much the same way that it receives to actual threats, which I think is hugely important for kids that are growing up in households where domestic violence is happening, and they are not necessarily the target of the abuse, but they're growing up near the abuse. And when we start thinking about less than ideal congregate care, foster care settings, or even when we think about our own reactions and responses to kids' behavior as potentially triggering them in an unintended way. I think this is going to be important moving forward. Dr. Enda did a fantastic job of framing out the global problems and the downstream consequences of ACEs and exposure to chronic traumatic events. And he started talking a little bit about the role that a number of neurotransmitters and hormones play in our response to chronic stress and trauma. The cortisol and adrenaline levels are important to pay attention to. And cortisol, any of you had cortisone shot at some point for an elbow, knee, ankle, something? Yeah, okay. So cortisol is a steroid that can actually help and be healing in smaller doses. At higher doses, it can be toxic and damaging to tissue. And adrenaline is also, we've commonly experienced adrenaline. I've got a little bit of it coursing through my veins right now. I'm a little nervous being in front of 500 of you. And these are normal responses to stress. I'm not disabled by the amount of adrenaline in my body. Hopefully it makes my thought process a little sharper at this point. We'll see if, how much I trip over my tongue in the next 45 minutes or so, however much time I've got left. And these things are associated with stress and allow our bodies to get ready for one of those three reactions, the fight, flight, freeze reactions. So they sort of prime our bodies to move and to mobilize. On the flip side of that slide, on the right side of the line, you've got serotonin and dopamine, which really in essence are antidotes to the cortisone and adrenaline. Now, little doses of cortisol and adrenaline are okay, and they're normal, and we get doses of those throughout the course of a day in our normal everyday lives. Kids that are exposed to chronic stress and multiple instances of trauma, Antwone Fisher, have significantly higher baseline rates of cortisol and adrenaline, which means that if my baseline, say, is here arbitrarily, that Antwone's baseline, he's always operating about here. How many have worked with kids or families that just seem to have a hair trigger, that the littlest thing will set them off and set them into one of those fright, fight, freeze responses? It's because their baselines have been recalibrated to be set a little bit higher than yours, or maybe a lot higher than yours, right? And so on the other side, serotonin and dopamine neurotransmitters can act as antidotes to cortisol and adrenaline in our bodies. And we can get these neurotransmitters in a variety of ways. We can get them in adaptive, healthy, safe ways. Some ways that can be potentially damaging are drugs, sex, and food on the extreme side, but certainly drugs, and Dr. Enda talked about the benefits of nicotine. That for those of you that are smokers, and I'm a former smoker, I remember that a little bit of nicotine really could help me relax and focus, much like caffeine does now. I don't smoke, but I sure do drink coffee, and that caffeine has very much the same impact on my body that nicotine once did. Sex, relationships, love, positive relationships with other people can increase levels of dopamine in our bodies. And if I can go back to my time at St. Anne's again, that one of the things I recognized early on in my career, it was one of my first jobs out of graduate school. I learned a tremendous amount there. I had fantastic supervisors, fantastic colleagues. And one of the things that I often struggled with is why the young women there who had been horrifically sexually and physically abused often put themselves in relationships that were just so damaging and so toxic and so dangerous. And they set themselves up to be hurt and hurt and hurt and hurt. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. And everyone talked about trauma and trauma being as being related to that. And I guess I sort of understood it, but when I saw this, it really started to make more sense to me. On a neurochemical level, we seek out ways to offset the ill effects of cortisol and adrenaline in our bodies. It doesn't feel good to have a lot of cortisone and adrenaline running through your body. And so wouldn't we engage in behavior that is likely to dump serotonin and dopamine into our bodies, overeat, abuse drugs and alcohol, engage in dangerous, risky sexual behaviors because the relationship in and of itself is going to put dopamine into our bodies at pretty high rates. So this stuff begins to make more sense. Again, those maladaptive behaviors have a function. They serve a purpose. They are helping individuals regulate some of the neurotransmitters and hormones that are flowing around in their bodies that are at higher baseline rates than kids with lower trauma exposure. Before the presentation, I heard sorry, Rob, but I heard Dr. Anda talking to the provost, who is a neurologist, and so I heard, two doctors talking about some pretty complex medical issues, and Dr. Anda, again, sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot, but we got a little nervous that he was going to be presenting in front of a neurologist. Well, now a social worker is going to be talking about neurobiology and neurology in front of Dr. Anda and a neurologist. So I'm going out on a limb here, but come with me. And what I hope to demonstrate is that this stuff is not as scary as it sounds. And it's important to understand it, and it does make sense, and it can help us modify our practice and behavior and interaction with kids and families. The amygdala is a very, very important part of the brain's makeup and functioning. And for those of you that aren't aware, it's right here at the top of the brainstem. And Dr. Anda did talk before about the development of the brain. Generally speaking, kind of starts at the base of the skull, where the spine ends, and kind of matures forward toward your eyebrows as you grow older and mature and develop. The amygdala sits right on top of the brainstem. It's the only part of the brain that is fully functioning and is ready to go at birth. You can think of it as a smoke detector. If there is any danger in the environment, the amygdala is going to pick up on it and mobilize a response. All sensory input all the time is always going through the amygdala. What you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch, passing through the amygdala. And so again, Antwone Fisher as an illustration, beginning to hear Jesse saying, "You got my back," passes through his amygdala. Antwone, having been exposed to a great deal of violence and danger, immediately goes to threat, perceived threat. His amygdala starts to mount a response. He gets a little tense. Why? Somebody after you? And so he immediately takes that defensive position. Okay? That's the amygdala mobilizing a protective response. The cerebellum is another very important part of the brain to be paying attention to. It's down here, kind of back of the head, underneath. It's really important because the cerebellum, when it is online and fully functioned, it helps to regulate lots of things, including frontal lobe activity and the management of emotional responses and thought. It also, when it's fully mature, triggers further and complete development of the frontal lobe, which we'll get to in a minute. And the cerebellum typically, normally, matures right around 14 to 18 in that range. And it plays a large role in the coordination of muscle movement, gross and fine motor movement. And so for those of you that may have young children, teenagers, they're gangly, awkward, kind of tripping over themselves, not all that athletic or graceful. And then as the cerebellum matures and fully develops, you see their actions and their behavior and their athletic skills really become much more refined very quickly. And that's the work of the cerebellum. In addition to refining and coordinating muscle movement, the cerebellum, turns out, helps to refine and coordinate lots of other activities, including emotional regulation. So it's a critical skill, a critical part of the brain as well. And it turns out that the best way to encourage cerebellum development is to get kids moving, to dance, to run, to play, to hike, to swim, to skateboard, all the kinds of things that we want kids to be doing anyway. And so start thinking about the environments that our kids are spending a lot of time in, whether it's public school, congregate care settings, foster care settings. Probably spending less time moving, more time playing video games, watching TV. But I also know that structurally we allow them less time to play. My daughter goes to a local public school, which is fantastic. The teaching staff are wonderful. The principal is tremendous. It is a wonderful school. I'm very happy about what she's getting there. And they don't play. They don't go outside very often. They don't have a lot of free play. It's class, 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 work, 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 work. And so how do we in public schools begin to think about the importance of dance and recreation and time on the playground? Vigorous activity, not for 10 minutes or 15 minutes after you've done scarfed up your lunch and you get a few minutes on the playground. But an hour or more of heavy-duty active physical play will actually encourage cerebellum development, which will also, downstream of that, encourage frontal lobe development. So that area behind your forehead is critical and really doesn't come fully online and doesn't fully mature until late teens, early 20s, and slows down quite a bit for kids that have been exposed to a great amount of trauma. The frontal lobe is critically important, and that's right up here, and so your eyebrows would be here and your eyes just about there. And there are many executive functions, but the ones that usually we're most concerned about in child welfare, juvenile justice, are consequential thinking. How many of you worked with youth who have gotten in trouble for the same behavior again and again and again and again, and they get punished and punished and punished, and at some point, some or all the adults working with them says, don't you get that when you do A, B happens? Like, that's a pretty easy connection for adults to make. Not so easy for youth to make. They're not actually connecting the dots. And that's a frontal lobe function. There are other frontal lobe functions that regulate emotion, and there are a couple of dozen executive functions, and they happen all together all the time. And I think a good analogy is, how many of you drive standard stick shift? Yeah. How many of you were really good at that when you first tried? Yeah. The first stick shift car I bought, well, the way I learned to drive a stick shift was I bought a car with a stick shift and tried to drive it out of the dealer's lot. And that was hysterical for my brother, who was driving in the car behind me, not so fun for me. I wasn't very good at it, because you got to pay attention to the gas, you got to pay attention to the clutch, you got to watch the brake, you got to be careful about getting the clutch in the exact right spot so you don't stall or buck, and then you got to worry about which gear is where, and then forget about turning the radio on or taking a cell phone call in the car. So over time, I got better at that. I'm pretty good at it these days. Learned to parallel park on hills, deal with stop signs. I remember early on I would not take it out of gear. I would just sort of coast, wait for red lights to turn green, and just keep on going, right? Because I didn't want to stop and have to do first gear all over again. Many of you are nodding. I'm not the only one who did that. Well, in many ways, frontal lobe functions are a lot like that. That it's not just working the clutch. It's not just working the gas. It's not just working the stick. It's paying attention to all of those things in concert, which takes time and repetition and practice and support and a safe environment in which to do that. Learning on the highway probably wasn't a good idea. Driving it out of the dealership probably wasn't a good choice in retrospect, right? And so we need to find time, opportunity, and provide safety and supports for our kids to practice and grow and develop these skills with an eye on what helps the frontal lobe mature and develop as other opportunities to mature other parts of the brain that have synergistic relationships with one another. Again, Dr. Anda talked a lot about the long-term consequences of trauma exposure. And I think a really effective way to demonstrate that is not so much in words, but in pictures, right? Picture says 1,000 words. Have any of you seen this slide before? Some? Yeah. Dr. Bruce Perry is a physician who's been doing a lot of work and looking a great deal on the impact of trauma and neglect on the developing brains of children. On the left, you see an image of a normal 3-year-old brain versus an image of a 3-year-old who suffered extreme neglect. I'm pretty confident that most of you would want your children to be the one on the left, not the one on the right. And yet we know kids who have been exposed to great amounts of trauma, neglect, abuse, abandonment, have severe impairment in brain development. Those connections between the parts of the brain, their frontal lobes are impaired, their cerebellums are impaired, and their amygdalas are wired. And they're racing. Like Dr. Anda had said, that car that is idling just a little too high, or maybe a lot too high, and it just takes a little touch of the gas pedal, and they're going 0 to 60. And that's what we're seeing in these youth. Dr. Anda had mentioned that ACEs are common. If we were to take the questionnaire, we would fall across a distribution and probably look very much like that CDC sample that he put up. I'm going to focus a little bit on children. And the good news is that in the general population, among most children, that per this study, half the children in this population had 0 exposure to ACEs, ages 0 to 17. But you see about a quarter had 1 and a quarter had 2 or more. And if we use this as a baseline and then dig a little deeper into child welfare, juvenile justice, and higher levels of care and intervention, we'll see those numbers start to go up. This is from a national study of about just shy of 6,000 children ages 2 months to 17 and a half years old. And this is based on case record and parent report. And these children had some contact, some degree of contact with the child welfare system, child protective, DSS, prevention, so on and so forth. And you can see the red, 51% of the children in this sample were endorsing an ACE score of 4 or more versus 13% in the CDC study that Dr. Anda mentioned. And so think about what that means in terms of brain development and potential downstream consequences regarding mental illness, behavior problems, emotional dysregulation, and long-term health consequences. All those slides that Dr. Anda put out this morning. So let's push a little deeper and talk about kids that are coming in contact with the juvenile justice system. A study of juveniles in detention in Pierce County, Washington. About 83% of that sample had an ACE score of 2 or more, and a third had a score of 4 or more. And there are studies like this popping up all over the place. As a nod to Carrie Sisson and the ACES community, Bob Foltz is a psychologist and researcher in Chicago, and he looked at a sample of residential youth and looked at their ACE scores and found that over half of that population that he studied are endorsing 4 or more ACEs. In the National Child Traumatic Stress Network survey, while they didn't use the ACEs questionnaire per se, they used a 20 question set that essentially mirrors the same questions: sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, incarceration of a parent, so on and so forth. And they found that 92% of that sample reported multiple traumatic events versus children not in residential care, and that the average, the mean number of trauma events experienced by these youth in residential care were 5.8. So on average, these children endorsed 5.86 yeses on the score, versus about half of that compared to non-residential populations. Which brings me to the point I made a little bit earlier, that kids are coming to us for externalizing behaviors, and it's our job to get past those behaviors and start looking for those underlying causes, that is trauma. So I want to get to how ACEs came to our attention at LaSalle and what we've been doing over the last couple of years. We are part of a local network of providers who are becoming more and more ACE informed, and that has everything to do with our relationship with University at Albany and Heather Larkin in particular, who, in my opinion, has been single-handedly responsible for making this community more ACE aware and has banded together all of these organizations in the HEART. The HEART's community are organizations around the Capital District that come together periodically and talk about the work they're doing to offset the damaging effects of the ACE scores of the youth and families that they're serving. And you can see all the organizations in the HEART. We started about 2 years ago taking ACE scores from all children in our environment. And you can see that about 52% of the youth that we serve, ages 10 to 21, are endorsing 4 or more ACEs. We have children as young as 10, 11, 12 years old in our population who are endorsing ACE scores of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We've taken the assessment and we've embedded it in all of our comprehensive evals, in all program areas: substance abuse, mental health, residential, day services, evening reporting center, our hard to place, our straight residential program. All kids who come in contact with our program areas are getting an ACE score as part of their comprehensive assessment. And we're beginning to take that ACE score and start asking more questions about what can we do differently to work with this child, to work with this family, to mitigate the impact of that ACE score. And starting to use that information and embedding it in our treatment plans. And so, as a result, I think it forces our clinicians who had not that long ago specialized in substance abuse or sexual abuse or mental health or fire setting, and it forces them to be asking a broader array of questions and talking about exposure to a number of other psychosocial problems, which arguably part of a good comprehensive assessment anyway, but I think having a formal instrument, which isn't all that burdensome, it's only 10 questions. Of course, I say that with LaSalle staff up there, yeah, that and the other 100 pieces of paper we have to do for any assessment, not that burdensome. But it's a relatively quick score to come to, and we're finding that it is helping our conversations internally among treatment providers about what we could be doing differently and how to choose the right combination of interventions to really start mitigating that damage. We also talk about it in treatment teams, with our direct care staff, with our faculty, with DSS workers, with family court, and we're beginning to have conversations about what these kids' ACE scores look like and how it might be manifesting in their behavior. We're beginning to use it to drive different types of treatment interventions. We've come to recognize that all of our children could benefit from better coping skills, from better emotional regulation skills, and we're beginning to build an ACES 101 group that all of our kids will go through, and we'll talk about the exposure to trauma that they've had, not specifically, but globally, and we'll talk about the elements of resilience and strength, and how have they gotten here as successful as they are. And so not to focus on the pathology, but to focus on the strengths and the skills and what has kept them safe, and how they can capitalize and leverage those skills and move forward and be more successful as they grow. Teaching them about healthy sexuality, relationships, making good choices, taking care of themselves and their partners is something we're offering more globally to all of our youth. We're not waiting for them to develop a sexual behavior problem to do these interventions. We're using it more prophylactically. We're also bringing this into our multifamily groups and drawing on the relationships that emerge naturally and spontaneously between parents who probably don't have good supports in their community, and encouraging them to talk to one another, support one another, drive to group with one another, look out for one another in the community and lean on each other. Which goes back to Dr. Anda's comment about building some multi-generational interventions to improve impact. We've been pretty good for a fair amount of time using non-traditional interventions. We've got a lot of our staff, clinicians, trained in adventure-based interventions. We use our rock wall. We use low elements, high elements as therapeutic interventions. We train other organizations how to use these interventions, and we've seen a lot of success. We can work on skills like communication, trust, empathy, healthy risk-taking. Tell me going on that rock wall wouldn't get some good adrenaline and good cortisol going. And then when you come down and you've been successful, you won't feel a good shot of dopamine coursing through your body. So can we start to teach some replacement skills through something that is movement-based, interactive, and relational, which I think is a good antidote for kids who have been exposed to a great amount of trauma. We're also looking at more expressive arts and dance interventions for kids that aren't that communicative. Their verbal skills aren't that hot, and there's nothing worse than trying to conduct a traditional psychotherapy group at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when everybody else in the community is out playing softball in the backfield. How do you compete with that? So if we can do stuff that's fun and sneak attack the treatment, we found that to be highly effective, and it turns out it's brain-based. That if they're moving, we're encouraging the development of their cerebellum, which is encouraging the development of their frontal lobe, which is going to help them do better in psychotherapy and make better decisions in the environment and once they've left us. We've taken all this information, and the information you see today, and for those of you, just show of hands, how many of you were here last year? A number of you. The information you saw me present last year and the information you're seeing today, we give to all of our staff. All areas, all levels, education, faculty, clinic, administration, residential, supervisors, everybody gets this, and they all get it together. We talk about the impact of trauma, we talk about brain development, we talk to them about how this will manifest in the behaviors of the youth and families that we work with. And we're doing that together consciously. We want to make sure that people have the same language We want to make sure that everyone understands that we're looking at the same thing. And as a result, we're seeing better communication and a shift in culture, which I'll get to in a moment. Some of the stuff we're not so good at, and I would love to hear from any of you that are good at this. We're not so good at the sensory integration interventions, and lots of communities are. James Freeman at the Casa Pacifica in California, he and his staff are very, very good at this. And we've begun to strike up a dialogue with them on the West Coast about how we could get better at incorporating some of those activities and interventions and skills for our staff, our faculty, our clinicians, and ultimately for the youth that we work with, and try to offset that typical crisis curve and help kids develop some more healthy, adaptive, less damaging to themselves and other coping skills. So the impact on culture that this has had, I think we've seen a remarkable shift in the last couple of years by letting staff, all staff, have access to the same information, training people together in the same room at the same time, has really led to better communication, has really led to a better sensitivity, an improvement in performance and intervention. And I did hear these things recently, and I hear them often, that our staff, our direct care staff, are talking to one another about Darren. Darren's a made-up name, by the way, but staff were talking about Darren's coming, and I heard he's got an 8, meaning his ACE score. And he said, this kid's going to need a lot of support. Just 2 years ago, we might have been saying, Darren's coming, and he's got an oppositional defiant disorder, and he's bipolar, and he's going to be a train wreck, and watch out for Darren. And so as we move away from pathology, if we move away from diagnostic labels, and we move toward a more trauma-informed culture and conversation, it shifts the perspective that we all take. Instead of bracing ourselves for Darren, we begin to embrace Darren and wrap him up with the support and the relationships that are going to make him healthier, safer, and stronger. And that's a tremendous thing to see happen. We've also heard staff, and I hear this quite a bit from Troy Kennedy. He's one of our staff that are responsible for training everyone on campus, and he talks about amygdalas being hijacked. We have staff all over campus talking about youth and their amygdalas. How great is that? And yes, their amygdalas have been hijacked. And it helps to depersonalize behavior. The kid didn't throw a chair at you because it's you. The kid threw a chair at you because their amygdalas were hijacked. And so it helps all of our staff understand that while they may be the target of the event, it's not really about them. It's about the kid and their history and the exposure to trauma. And it helps our staff move to a more productive space with our youth. It also provides some really comprehensive interventions and a concrete platform to talk to other disciplines. That physicians get this, social workers get this, judges get this. ACES makes sense. It's very concrete, it's very accessible, and it's universal. And so it starts getting us talking about the same thing. One of the things I also want to show you is that in addition to taking youth scores, we started taking staff scores. And it's probably no shock to anybody in the audience that people who are drawn to human services, child welfare, juvenile justice, we've got our own baggage. All of you are nodding. You've all sat in graduate school with that student who just has a little too much to disclose in class, right? I remember. None of you guys, my students, nobody in this class. Nobody in this class, very good class. But we all remember, right? Turns out that we asked our staff to complete the survey, and look at those numbers. LaSalle staff in red, the original CDC sample in blue. Our staff have some pretty high ACE scores. What does that mean to you? Let me break it down a little further. By department, this is really interesting. Look at our direct care staff in residential programming. They're purple. 40% of our residential staff reported yes to 4 or more questions on the ACE questionnaire. Clinic in red are social workers, psychologists, about a third. Administration, Bill. He was not honest, I think. Right. Where did he go with his whole
Right.
right? Something tells me Bill wasn't completely honest, but. So what does this mean for staff? Well, let's take it one step further. And again, this is not specific to LaSalle or St. Anne's or anybody else, but if you're working in a child welfare juvenile justice system, if you've got people who are working day in and day out with youth and families, generally the folks that are on the front lines doing all that work, right? When I was a clinician, I carried a caseload. I saw a kid for an hour, maybe 2 hours a week. Well, who was with them the other 23 hours in that day? Our direct care staff, right? Our paraprofessionals. So they often make the base, the foundation of the work, the interventions, the jobs that we all have really are hugely dependent on the direct care staff and the paraprofessionals that we're all working with. And then above that, we've got our professional staff and then the administration. And so you can see, on the bottom, these are the folks that are working with the kids most of the time. And then they come in contact with our professionals, our clinic staff, faculty, nurses, physicians. And then they have very little contact with administration. And I'll use myself as an example. I started in my career as a foster care caseworker for St. Christopher Otterly in Long Island, and I was with kids constantly. Is there St. Christopher up here? Yes. All right. All right. And so I spent hours and hours and hours and hours of every day with the youth that I was working with. And then I became a clinician, and I spent less time with kids, and now I'm an administrator. And kids come and go from LaSalle, and I don't even know their names, which doesn't feel good at all. It doesn't feel good at all. And at this point in my career, I've got a ton of experience. I've had a ton of exposure. I've got a lot of formal education. I get to talk to all of you about all this stuff. I get to spend time with Dr. Anda and be at the top of my game, and I have almost zero contact with kids, which seems a bit upside down, in my opinion. And then I think about our direct care staff, and we're fortunate at LaSalle to have staff, direct care staff, who have been with us 10, 15, 20, 25 years, and so they are not inexperienced. But generally speaking, direct care staff in facilities, congregate care facilities, don't have the formal education that our professional staff do. They don't have MSWs, they don't have PhDs. They're not getting paid what the professionals and the administrators are. There's a higher degree of turnover. They're less formally prepared for the work that is critically important. And then if you permit me a bit of an editorial comment, because I've got the stage and the microphone, there's nothing you can do about it. I think about the Justice Center, and while I won't minimize the potential damage and violence that can occur in congregate care facilities, and I don't want any child or any adult to get hurt ever again. But I wonder what would have happened if we had spent a fraction of that budget, the time, and the energy on training staff, professionalizing the interventions, and setting a higher standard for the work and helping people get there rather than just waiting for people to make mistakes, who, by the way, have high ACE scores, and little professional training and preparation. And then when they make a mistake, because their amygdalas got hijacked, the Justice Center is waiting for them. So just food for thought. Food for thought. So as a system, how do we move away from simply managing disruptive behaviors? Stop it. To moving to an environment that is intervening early, appropriately, gets a kid to the right level of care at the right time for the right amount of treatment, achieving the right outcome, and fostering health, growth, resilience. And again, I think that's done best through a community and different people with their respective strengths and skills coming together across networks, across regulatory areas, across disciplines, and really asking. And I'll set Ray Shimmer up for the afternoon in terms of policy in New York State. I think we are at a critical intersection in time where we could make some really interesting things happen as Medicaid redesign happens, as OASIS and OMH and OCFS and OPWDD and State Ed start taking a look at what they need to do to prepare themselves for integrated services, and as behavioral health providers move across lines and disciplines. and as we consider raise the age and other reforms to juvenile justice, we are primed as a state to be really taking this information and running with it and making some very, very good decisions. And I hope that all of you will keep all the decision makers on point and talking to one another and talking about what we could be doing differently as a system and taking the information and running with it. Thanks for your time today.